Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Hara Lang. I'm the Executive Director of PHAP, that's short for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection. I am absolutely delighted to be welcoming all of you today for this second session in this series, Learning Stream on Navigating Change, jointly organized by ICVA and PHAP. We're particularly excited today to see such a great turnout with participants I saw coming in from more than 100 countries, joining both here in the Adobe Connect platform as well as on the live stream via YouTube. Great to have everyone with us for this discussion. The starting point for today's event comes from the ICVA scoping study entitled Civil Society Space and Humanitarian Action. I believe my colleague Sheila will be posting links in the chat to this and other resources that are mentioned throughout the coming hour and a half for your ease of access. My co-facilitator from ICVA, Nishani Jayamaha, and I will, so she will start by providing an overview of the scoping study from ICVA, and then we will hear from 4 experts about the critical issues of restrictions on civil society space and discuss the implications for humanitarian action. I'd like to warmly welcome, for the first time actually, Nishani as co-host. She's been behind the scenes for all of the PHAP ICVA webinars over the last couple of years, and it is just a great treat to have her here as co-host. Nishani, if you want to introduce yourself as well.
Thank you so much, Hara. It's actually a pleasure to be an interface actually on this webinar, and it's amazing to see so many people online joining us from all over the world, and to our second session, How do NGOs Navigate the Shrinking Civil Society Space in our Learning Stream Navigating Change. So at a time when the political landscape across the world is changing at a rapid pace, it is timely, we think, to discuss not only the challenges and how it impacts their operations, the NGOs' operations, but also how NGOs are already navigating in this environment, especially in conflict and complex emergency contexts. So we also have the opportunity today to hear from other actors such as ICNL, a research and education-based organization, and the Danish donor government on what some of the measures that can be taken to respond to the current trends. This is, of course, in addition to our NGO colleagues, NRC and South Sudan Forum, who's here. So let's maybe look at how we can look at some ways forward to navigate this changing environment we're in. I'd also like to thank our donors, Konrad and Hanson Foundation, the German Humanitarian Assistance, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark, the Swedish International Development Corporation, the agency SIDA, the Swiss Agency for Development Cooperation, and our ICVA members who provide special support to the learning stream and core support to ICVA to make these learning sessions a reality.
Thank you, Nishani. Now, before we start the substance of the session, I will briefly explain a few technical aspects of the platform so that you can all get the most out of this interactive experience. First, submitting questions. If you have any questions for the speakers at any time throughout the coming hour and a half, submit them using the Ask a Question box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Note, if you would like to ask the question anonymously, you should make a note of this when submitting it. Otherwise, we'll use your first name and perhaps your location if we know where you're joining us from today. So if you'd like it to be anonymous, just make a note of it, and we'll be sure to do that. Next, you will be seeing snap polls appearing several times during the session. These are to gauge your views or experience and add to the richness of the discussion. You'll see now a couple of test polls displayed as an example. You can just click on a response, or for free text polls, as on the right-hand side, click in the text box, enter the response, and click Submit. And note that for all of the polls, whether multiple choice or free text polls, all of your answers are anonymous. Finally, if you encounter any technical problems with the platform, you're invited to use one of our video or audio backup live streaming options. These are helpful in that they use less bandwidth. However, note that they do not allow for the same degree of interactivity. To connect to them, just follow the links that you see now on your screen. My colleague Sheila will also share these links again, if needed, during the event in the chat. So if you're having a problem with the audio, just make a quick note in the chat, and Sheila will be sure to send those links through to you again, so you don't have to go back hunting for them. So to get started with today's events, and before handing over to Nishani, who's going to give us an intro based on ICVA's work on this topic, I would like to introduce our guest panelists. First of all, David Moore, who's Vice President for Legal Affairs with the International Center for Nonprofit Law, ICNL, as Nishani mentioned, will provide a broad overview, share some of the trends and drivers of shrinking civil society space. Second, we're very pleased to have with us, and I do hope the connection works because we had a bit of trouble earlier on today, but hopefully we'll have with us Pius Ajara, who is Director of the South Sudan NGO Forum, and who will provide his perspectives on issues faced regarding shrinking space in South Sudan and how they have been addressing these issues in that specific context. Next, we're delighted to have with us Emma OLeary, who is Senior Humanitarian Policy Advisor with the Norwegian Refugee Council here in Geneva, who will discuss the impact of counterterrorism measures for NGOs working in humanitarian response. And last but not least, Thomas Hanson, Senior Policy Advisor and Team Leader for the Civil Society Team within the Department for Humanitarian Action, Migration and Civil Society with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark, will discuss what governments can do to improve support for civic space at the EU, the UN, and in bilateral relations with other states. And I'll note, in addition to Thomas Hanson, I believe we have his colleague Thomas Thompson, who will most likely be jumping in as well. So we have two Thomases on the line from Denmark. Welcome to both of you. So now, without further ado, we will hear from Nishani, who will provide an overview of ICVA's scoping study, a brief overview, I'll say, because we do want to hear from our guest speakers today, starting with an essential question: is it actually the case that the space for civil society is actually shrinking? Over to you, Nishani.
Thank you, Hara, and I'm waiting for it to load. Yes. So it is interesting. This question, is the space for civil society actually shrinking, was asked at OECD's Civil Society Days conference in Paris earlier this June. And some argue that it is not shrinking, but it's actually changing. So if we take a look at the data, in 2017, the Civicus Monitor reported that there was a serious systemic problem with civic space in 109 countries. And in 2018, this number has gone up to 111 countries. Furthermore, an estimated 7.5 billion world population, over 6 billion people in the world are living in either closed, repressed, or obstructed civic space. So I will not go into the overall trends on this, because David in his presentation also will delve deeper into this aspect. But one of the things that we want to highlight is the space for humanitarian action is that shrinking. So the Civicus Secretary General Lisa John highlights in the State of Civil Society report that the right to provide humanitarian response is under attack in a way unparalleled since the Second World War. That's quite a statement. But humanitarian organizations work in extremely challenging contexts, such as conflicts or severely politically unstable settings or man-made or natural disaster situations. For staff and organizations working in such challenging environments, the restrictions placed on them by host governments, institutional donors, and non-state actors further exacerbate the existing restricted space and hinder the delivery of life-saving support to people fleeing such circumstances. And not only is the space for civil society shrinking in countries that the largest number of refugees are fleeing from, as you can see the graphics on the presentation, but attacks on civic space has been increasing in countries that were rarely experienced before, even in stable governments where they were more open before, have become restricted, especially in their refugee and migrant policies. You can read more on this in the report of the independent expert on human rights and international solidarity on the issue of criminalization or suppression of the rendering of humanitarian assistance to migrants and refugees who enter a state in irregular manner. This is a long, winding topic, but Sheila will share you the link to this report as well. And it is in this context that ICVA, through the independent scoping study carried out in 2018 by Andrew Cunningham and Steve Tibet, wanted to capture that what ICVA members and our network of national, international, regional NGO networks and NGO fora were facing as challenges, and we wanted to try and understand what their needs might be. We also wanted to look at what could ICVA's role be in supporting NGOs to better navigate civil society and humanitarian space. You can read our full report online. It's on our website, and also the link will be shared to you on the chat. And you will see polls coming up right now, and I hope you can actually give us some of your feedback, because we want to hear from you as well. And so kind of giving a quick glance, and as mentioned by Anhad, we don't want to spend too much time on this because we are really here to pick out some of these challenges and have the speakers and experts and practitioners here on our panel to give you a bit of a better overview and their perspectives on this. But in our study, 50% of both national and global NGOs indicated that in the past few years, around 5 or so years, in their opinion and in their experience, challenges of operating as a humanitarian actor had increased substantially. The UNSG's report to the 2019 ECOSOC session on strengthening of coordination of emergency humanitarian assistance of the UN indicates that in 2017, 158 major incidents of violence against humanitarian operations occurred in 22 countries, affecting 313 aid workers. The report refers that at the field level, the acceptance of humanitarian workers is increasingly challenged, and that looting, misappropriation, and violence against and detention and abduction of humanitarian workers, mainly national staff, continue to take place. That is quite alarming. So the main challenges that we see, and hearing from some of these reports that are coming up, but also from some of the scoping study surveys and interviews, is access, and access to populations, geographic areas for delivery were some to name, and the nature of armed conflicts have changed with an increasing lack of respect to protection of civilians by non-adherence to IHL and international human rights law. And the scoping study indicates that legal barriers and restrictions are some of the main issues impeding access to populations. We will hear a bit more from David and Emma on how legal frameworks and counterterrorism legislation is impacting humanitarian action, and what measures and recommendations they may have for NGOs and other actors to navigate within this space. And we'll also hear from Pius from South Sudan NGO Forum, who will share his perspectives on the challenges faced by NGOs due to bureaucratic and administrative barriers to deliver life-saving assistance at the country level, among other barriers that are faced by NGOs on the ground. Also to note that with rising needs, the funding gap is also increasing. And not only do NGOs face challenges in accessing populations, but they also face obstacles to access principled humanitarian funding, which in turn, of course, hamper organizations to deliver efficient and effective humanitarian assistance on the ground, especially to NGOs and especially national NGOs. We look forward to hearing from both Thomases, Hanson and Thomas Thompson, to provide us a bit of a perspective from donors and governments on how they are supporting NGOs who are faced with such challenges. So we hope that we can tease out a few of these issues during our webinar. And over to you, Hara, to introduce the first speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishani. Yes, we are first going to turn to David. David Moore, as mentioned, is Vice President of Legal Affairs with the International Center for Nonprofit Law, ICNL, where he has worked since 2001, managing several of ICNL's global programs designed to protect and expand civic space. He has published extensively on issues of civil society law and has served as a trainer on civil society legal issues for government officials, civil society representatives, and UN staff. So, David, I will turn the virtual floor over to you. Your presentation should appear momentarily. There we are.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers, thanks to Jani and Angharad, and to the technical team, as well as on whom we're all dependent. And thanks to everyone for joining. It's a real pleasure to be participating. For more than 25 years, ICNL has been working to protect and expand civic space. That is the legal environment in which individuals and groups exercise their civic freedoms, their rights to association, assembly, and expression. We at ICNL believe that the legal environment for civil society is essential for the work of civil society organizations, including humanitarian organizations. Since 2001, however, civic space has been under threat, subject to increasing government restrictions, legal restrictions on civil society. We've seen several waves of restrictions in the past 19 years, in the wake of the color revolutions in the mid-2000s, in the wake of the Arab Spring. But what of late? Let's look at the data from the past 5 years. Since 2013, ICNL has tracked 269 regulatory initiatives affecting civil society. Of these 269 regulatory initiatives, 67% can be called restrictive, while 33% may be labeled as enabling. So you can see as a threshold point that it's a mixed picture and not one without hope. But nonetheless, the predominant trend globally is one and remains one of increasing constraints. Drilling down on the 67%, that is the 180 restrictive initiatives, we can see that the trend, is truly global. No region is immune. And the trend affects diverse political systems as well, including both authoritarian states and democracies. In considering the impact of this global trend, it's legitimate to ask which segments of civil society are most affected. And there are a couple of different ways to view this. One is a core periphery view, by which I mean that in many countries, it's the human rights and advocacy organizations that are really the core target group of legal restrictions. But that closing space affects a broader array of organizations, including development and humanitarian organizations, because the laws that are put in place are often generally applicable, and because the stigmatizing rhetoric that the government uses to justify the constraints end up tarnishing the sector as a whole. But at the same time, in some countries, humanitarian organizations themselves may be the primary target of restrictive measures. We saw this years ago in 2009 in Sudan, for example, where the government there ordered the expulsion of 13 of the largest NGOs providing humanitarian aid in response to an arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court. And just last week, I was in Myanmar meeting with international NGOs there who are struggling to deliver humanitarian aid to conflict areas in the country due to a prohibitive set of approval procedures that target those groups in particular. So whether it's a question of being a core target or a peripheral target, the impact of closing civic space is pervasive. How do the legal barriers actually affect civil society organizations? Well, of the 180 restrictive initiatives that we've been tracking since 2013, we find that more than half are constraints on the life cycle of organizations, that is the formation, the registration, or the activities of organizations. Roughly 22% constrain the exercise of assembly rights, and 20% target the flow of international funding. So you can see from these categories of barriers that there would be significant impediments for humanitarian organizations as well, particularly in terms of life cycle barriers, that is impediments to the formation or registration of humanitarian organizations, and international funding barriers, which often include advanced government approval processes before international funds can be received, but also would include those measures that stem from counterterrorism approaches, which often result in things like bank de-risking and the exclusion of CSOs from financial services. And again, I think we'll hear more about that in Emma's presentation. Now, there are often questions about what's driving this closing civic space trend. And of course, the factors are diverse, and it does depend on the individual country context. But I'll put a few ideas on the table that I think are often relevant for many regions, for many countries. One is the broader democratic recession. I think the civic space challenges we're seeing cannot be separated from the broader challenges we're seeing to democracy in countries around the world. And the fact that civil society is often no longer viewed as a pillar of democracy, but rather viewed as a conduit for foreign interference. Also a significant problem and a shift that we've seen in the past 20 years. There are a range of factors, of justifications, including counterterrorism, transparency, development effectiveness, which are legitimate, but nonetheless are often used by governments to justify overreaching regulation. Counterterrorism in particular, again, since 2001, at least 140 governments around the world have adopted counterterrorism legislation. Clearly, this is a key driver. We're also seeing a range of global societal trends around climate change, conflict, migration, all of which can lead to reactions from civil society, protests from civil society, which can in turn lead to increasing state responses in the form of regulation. So a number of factors we see as relevant to driving this civic space problem. The diagnosis is much easier than the cure. Here I'm going to try to consider in a couple of minutes the effective tools and strategies to respond to this closing civic space challenge, to protect and expand civic space. And I think a key point here is that the tools and strategies I'll put on the table have proved effective in a number of country contexts and international contexts. None of them are guaranteed, none of them are a magic bullet, but they all, I think, are potential tools that are worthy of consideration. So starting with enhancing international standards, we've seen significant work done around UN Human Rights Council resolutions relating to civic space, special rapporteur reports dealing with issues from access to resources to most recently the fundamental freedoms in the digital era, as well as the impact of counterterrorism on civic space, also recently published. These expand the soft law norms around civic space, which can then in turn be used by national level partners for advocacy. And we've seen this happen with some effect in a number of places. Advancing legal reform. Despite the global trend, we have seen successful pushback against restrictive proposals and successful enabling reform as well. So, for example, last year in Sri Lanka, restrictive amendments to a CSO law there were withdrawn following a concerted pushback by civil society groups. Earlier this year in Ethiopia, a new proclamation on CSOs enacted that repealed and replaced the notorious 2009 Charities and Societies Proclamation. So a clear improvement for Ethiopia. So there are successes that can be celebrated. Civil society coalitions are often a key means for advancing legal reform, but also, of course, have broader potential value. We've seen this both at the national level and at the international level. For example, an NPO coalition on engagement with PHAP, the Financial Action Task Force, has proven effective in engaging with that multilateral body. Dialogue with policy actors, hugely important. And again, we've seen this work to great effect at the national level, for example, in Afghanistan, where there is a informal CSO government working group. We've also seen this with multilateral bodies. I just mentioned a moment ago PHAP, the Financial Action Task Force. There's also engagement with the Open Government Partnership, with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, and a number of other levers through which organizations can help address civic space concerns through different lenses. But in some cases, advocacy improvements are really not on the table. And there we try to work with local partners to navigate the restrictions more effectively. That is, to be able to pursue their missions in a hostile legal framework without being subjected to closure or other sanctions. And we do this through things like a voluntary legal audits or compliance trainings so that groups can reduce their vulnerabilities and still try to pursue their missions effectively. And of course, there are rapid response mechanisms as well. I won't detail them, but just to say that there is emergency grant support available for embattled CSOs. So that, again, there are a number of things that have proven, that are proving successful. This is not a comprehensive list. Just a few ideas, and I'll leave you with I think the question of how humanitarian organizations can engage effectively in some of these response mechanisms, and look forward to discussing that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, David. Just a couple of quick reflections on the poll to note that we had the vast majority of participants in today's event experiencing themselves the kinds of restrictions that you've described, and some interesting examples shared. There are far too many now to list, but just to highlight a few examples: restrictions on political lobbying from foreign-funded bodies, other issues related to foreign funding, another example related to speech issues, restrictions on rural communities speaking up about water shortages was one example raised, but really bringing examples from all over the world. As you noted, it truly is a global phenomenon. We've had a number of great questions come in. I know Nishani has one lined up for you. Over to you, Nishani.
Thanks, Hara. And David, there's really a lot of food for thought there. There's lots of avenues for civil society and NGOs to engage, and it is true that I would like to ask you back on, have you had any examples where NGOs in the humanitarian sector have had any opportunities to take the opportunity to use some of these tools that you mentioned to combat or navigate the shrinking space? And the other thing is that, do you have any best practice or one good example that has come out from your work and from what you've been doing and helping these NGOs that can be a shining example, or at least something to think about for our participants out there? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nishani. Yes, in terms of trying to answer the question I pose myself, in terms of how humanitarian NGOs can engage, I see interesting possibilities both at the international level and at the national level. First, at the international level, I think there are important opportunities to contribute to the norm setting or the standard setting around the soft law norms affecting civic space, affecting counterterrorism, through input to the UN Special Rapporteur thematic reports, for example. And again, we've seen, I think, a couple of reports come out just recently that are relevant to civil society broadly and humanitarian organizations in particular. And there may be opportunities to help ensure that those reports are received, known about, understood among partners at the national level, so they can use those as advocacy tools. Moving away from soft law to slightly harder, more binding requirements, there's engagement with multilateral mechanisms such as PHAP. I've mentioned that during the presentation, Financial Action Task Force. There is much work to be done there, and a role for humanitarian organizations in the risk assessment processes that is taking place that the national governments should be conducting prior to a PHAP evaluation of the country's counterterrorism law. And that's a process that should be open broadly to civil society, but should certainly include humanitarian organizations. So basically, good opportunities, I think, for input into some of these soft law and multilateral processes at the international level. At the national level, we have seen humanitarian organizations contribute to coalitions of civil society around changes to laws. For example, in Myanmar, when the association law was revised back in 2014, humanitarian organizations were part of that discussion. They were part of that process, both local groups and international groups. And I think when you talk about a shining example, even though there can be different concerns among different segments of civil society, and clearly humanitarian organizations have distinctive concerns, there are also shared concerns. And to see the groups come together and speak through one coalition is more likely to lead to a positive impact with the government lawmakers.
Thanks, David. This is Hara jumping in. Just to follow up on that point, so you were speaking about the value of coming together in a shared coalition. We just had a question come in, though, from Sylvia. She's wondering, would it be possible for you to expand a bit actually on the different types of barriers and constraints that are faced between international NGOs on the one hand and local NGOs on the other? Would there be any examples you could potentially share?
Sure. In too many countries, the governments do take a targeted regulatory approach towards INGOs, towards international NGOs. From a perspective of good international practice, we like to think of an equal playing field between domestic and international organizations, that both groups should be able to be registered without serious impediment and be able to operate without too much burden. But in many countries, the international organizations will be subject to special regulation, especially and sometimes a separate law on INGOs, and special scrutiny. In some cases, domestic groups may have a voluntary registration system, but INGOs in most cases have a mandatory registration system in order to operate. They're often subject to higher reporting burdens and so on. So yes, INGOs do come under special scrutiny. We see this time and time again. Myanmar is one example. Pakistan is another. China. I mean, there are a range. I've been focusing on Asia in recent months, as you might tell. But there are a range of different approaches that the governments will use. And what that often does is create a split in terms of the response, because it can be hard to get domestic and international groups on the same page in terms of how to respond. In some countries, we've seen that domestic groups feel like INGOs should be subject to greater regulation. In other cases, we've seen them come together and work to respond more effectively. So I hope that answers the question, at least in part, but of course it is a complex subject.
It does. No, that was very, very helpful. Thank you. So we're going to move now to Emma. Emma OLeary, as I mentioned at the start, is NRC's Senior Humanitarian Policy Advisor with a focus on the impact of counterterrorism measures on principled humanitarian action. She is the author of Principles Under Pressure, NRC's recent report on the issue. She previously worked in Yemen and Afghanistan for NRC and for the International NGO Safety Organization, INSO, on issues of humanitarian access and negotiations. Emma, over to you. Thank you, and thank you to PHAP and ICVA for bringing us together today on this important topic. From what I can see, there are some little elements of my first slide missing, but perhaps I can start and we can try and bring those elements back in. So I want to start by framing the issue. What are we talking about when we say, or when we talk about the impact of counterterrorism on humanitarian action? So since 9/11, we've seen governments and international organizations like the UN and the EU step up their efforts to try and prevent funding and other forms of support to going to what are called terrorist organizations. Now, this is, broadly speaking, done in the following way. So the UN or the EU will designate a group or an individual as terrorist. They'll add them to a list of designated terrorists, and they'll then make it illegal to provide that individual or group with funds or with support. Member states must then reflect this list at domestic level, but they can, of course, also develop their own lists, as, for example, the UK and the US have done. Both have a comprehensive domestic list of their own. Now, it's key here to remember that there's actually no internationally recognized definition of terrorism, and this means that states have adopted very broad definitions of terrorism domestically, and they've criminalized vastly different activities and groups as a result. For humanitarian organizations, it's important to remember that donors will often then reflect domestic legislation around counterterrorism in grant agreements. They do so in very different ways. Some will not mention counterterrorism at all in their grant agreements. They'll believe it's covered by existing requirements around anti-diversion, anti-money laundering policies, and so on. But others may go well beyond domestic legislation and have very, very strict requirements. An example here is the USAID anti-terror certification. So every USAID grantee needs to sign a certification which essentially says their organization has not within the past 10 years and will not in future provide any form of material support to designated terrorist groups. So a very, very strict requirement there. And we as humanitarian organizations are legally bound to comply with legislation and sanctions around counterterrorism, and then we're of course contractually bound to comply with relevant clauses in our grant agreements. These measures then become an issue for us when we operate in areas that are controlled by designated terrorist groups, and we need to engage with those groups for the purposes of securing access to populations who are in need of assistance. Now, as we all know, these groups often establish themselves as local authorities in their areas of operation. They'll have well-established systems of checkpoints, of taxations, and this means that we run the risk of potentially falling foul of these counterterrorism measures in the course of our engagement with them. So when we raise this issue of the impact of counterterrorism on humanitarian action, people sometimes question whether or not there have actually been kind of any legal repercussions for NGOs. And the answer is a definite yes. There aren't a lot of examples of this happening, but there are enough, and they've had quite a significant impact on the sector. The first major such case was the case of U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder versus the Humanitarian Law Project, which took place in 2010. In that case, the Humanitarian Law Project, a small US-based NGO, it provided training in international humanitarian law to the Kurdish PKK and to the Tamil Tigers. Now, both of these groups are designated as foreign terrorist groups by the United States. And the US Supreme Court upheld that those trainings provided by the Humanitarian Law Project for those groups essentially amounted to support for a terrorist group. The Supreme Court in its ruling stated that those trainings could actually legitimize these terrorist organizations and free up the organization's resources so that they could use them for terrorist activities. So this case really sent shockwaves throughout the sector because it reflected that something as innocuous and as potentially innocent as a training in international humanitarian law could be seen as support to a designated terrorist group. Now, there are several other examples here as well. The most recent one being that involving Norwegian People's Aid, that was last year. Norwegian People's Aid was fined $2 million by USAID due to an unintentional breach of the USAID, an unintentional breach of the USAID anti-terrorist certification that I mentioned earlier, that certification that requires a grantee to say they have not within the past 10 years and will not in future provide support to designated terrorist groups. And this was in relation to NPA's activities in Palestine and in Iran. Now, this is a very interesting case with lots of intriguing nuances, and we could certainly do a 1-hour webinar on this alone. I won't go into the detail here because of time constraints, but I would encourage you, if you haven't already read about the case, to go away and have a look at it if you're interested. Moving on, I want to take a quick look at some of the impacts that we've seen of counterterrorism measures at field level. Now here I think it's important to remember that the impacts of counterterrorism measures are sometimes linked with wider security issues, logistical constraints and so on at field level. So they can be challenging to identify, but they are there. One of the key impacts I wanted to talk about today is the fact that counterterrorism measures can prevent organizations from programming on the basis of needs alone. They force us to take into account the presence of certain groups and to potentially avoid areas where those groups might be operating. An example here is Nigeria. There's an ongoing conflict in the northeast of the country between the government and Boko Haram. Boko Haram is a designated terrorist group, and the government of Nigeria is very much using a counterterrorism agenda to limit the humanitarian response in the northeast of the country. There are very few humanitarian organizations working in or trying to work in areas outside of government control in the northeast of the country. Those that have tried to expand their operations have been accused by the government and by the security forces of diversion of aid and of support to terrorism. These restrictions placed on humanitarian action in northeast Nigeria have had a really devastating impact on principled humanitarian action there. There's an estimated, conservative estimates now of 800,000 people in areas under the control of Boko Haram, and these people are not getting access to the aid that they need simply because of their location in an area that's under the control of a designated terrorist group. Another interesting example of impact is Somalia, where we've seen counterterrorism measures and sanctions really cause organizations to self-censor and to also restrict their operations to government-held areas. Now, Somalia is the only country where there is a humanitarian exemption to a UN Security Council sanctions regime. This exemption was introduced after sanctions against al-Shabaab negatively impacted the response to the famine in 2010. The sanctions resulted in a dramatic cut really in donor funding for operations in al-Shabaab held areas, and they caused NGOs in some cases to actually stop their operations in those areas because they were concerned about the legal implications of doing so. So after lobbying by humanitarian organizations who were concerned about the limitations that the sanctions placed on their operations and their response to the famine, the exemption was introduced. However, despite the fact that the exemption is in place, almost no humanitarian organizations are actually operating in al-Shabaab controlled areas today. This is partly because the exemption is limited. It is limited to UN agencies, to their implementing partners, and to organizations with UN observer status, so it's the ICRC. But it's also because the exemption hasn't always been reflected by every member state. And there's a real concern among humanitarian organizations that they are still legally exposed and that they could still be at risk of criminal prosecution as a result of their operations in al-Shabaab held areas. It's widely known al-Shabaab have a system of taxation, and there's a huge fear among humanitarian organizations of even one incident of diversion having massive reputational impacts for them and a resulting impact on funding streams as well in a very competitive funding environment. So as a result, organizations are really reticent to use the exemption, and many of them believe it's simply easier to operate in government-held areas in this kind of environment. And of course, this serves to reinforce al-Shabaab's existing perception of humanitarian organizations as non-neutral and as potentially supporting or endorsing one party to a conflict.
And finally, in terms of impact, I want to mention the issue of bank de-risking, which has already been mentioned by David in his presentation. So humanitarian organizations are, of course, not the only ones who need to comply with counter-terrorism rules. Banks do as well. In recent years, we've really seen enforcement action against banks for counter-terrorist financing and anti-money laundering violations increase. Banks have far less appetite for risk than they might have done previously, and as a result, they're taking an increasingly conservative approach towards their dealings with NGOs. And banks are now asking for extreme levels of due diligence information prior to providing NGOs with services such as bank transfers. Organizations have reported that banks have asked them, to provide the names of every single one of their donors, even if they provided $5 or less before agreeing to provide bank transfers for the NGO in question. And obviously this causes massive delays, and sometimes even despite the provision of that information, banks can still refuse to carry out transfers. And crucially, they can do that with no notice and with no explanation as to why they've taken that decision. Now, of course, this has widespread effects. It makes it very challenging to ensure program continuity in areas where bank de-risking is an issue. It can make it challenging to pay staff, to pay contractors and suppliers. And in conflict-affected environments, of course, there are obvious protection and security risks around that as well. While the impacts are widespread, I think it's important to mention that small NGOs and Islamic NGOs are particularly impacted by bank de-risking, largely because of the really unfortunate bias that banks have in terms of viewing these organizations as particularly at risk of being abused for the purposes of terrorist financing. And ultimately, this issue of bank de-risking serves to push organizations outside the formal banking system where bank transfers aren't available. They'll have to find other ways of getting money to where it needs to go. And this has resulted in an increase in the use of tactics like cash carrying, where staff members of organizations might carry large amounts of cash on their person over borders, obviously at great personal risk to themselves, and of course ultimately actually increasing the risk that this money falls into the hands of designated terrorist groups. Ultimately, what we're going to see if this really worrying trend continues is that banks will ultimately dictate where humanitarian organizations can operate. And I want to move on to quickly take a look at some of the mitigating measures and the coping mechanisms that organizations have used as they try to deal with what is an increasingly restrictive counterterrorism environment. I first of all would mention the rise of risk management, or the increased use of risk management, or the increased focus perhaps on risk management. So I think we can all agree that across the sector, organizations have increasingly been focusing on due diligence and compliance in recent years. In many ways, this is positive. We all want to ensure that aid reaches its intended recipients and that it isn't diverted. In 2015, NRC produced the Risk Management Toolkit in relation to counterterrorism measures, and this is a tool, a public document that can be accessed by anyone. It outlines different compliance strategies, HR tools, ways of analyzing donor grant agreements, and so on. So different tools that can be used as organizations try to maintain compliance while also maintaining a principled approach to their programming. On the more worrying side, we have got the rise of remote management. So this is a strategy whereby international organizations will pull out of an area and they'll instead choose to implement through a local partner organization in that area. Now this is often presented quite positively. It's presented as sometimes as part of the localization agenda, efforts to use the skills and capacity of local organizations to better effect. However, it must be recognized that there is often an element of risk transfer where remote management is used. And what we are sometimes seeing is international organizations passing on the risks, including the counterterrorism risks of operating in these complex environments, to local organizations who often simply don't have the same compliance capacity as larger organizations. What we're seeing in many cases is a risk transfer from donors onto international organizations, and then from international organizations to NGOs. Finally, I want to briefly mention, in terms of mitigating measures, the issue of humanitarian exemptions. So I previously outlined the use of humanitarian exemption in Somalia and the issues that arose there. While the application of the exemption in Somalia was not perfect, I think it's important to remember that if worded well and applied correctly, humanitarian exemptions are the surest possible way to protect humanitarian operations from the impact of counterterrorism measures. This has been the subject of some strong joint advocacy recently. An example in point is the UK counterterrorism bill that was introduced at the end of last year. That would have given the UK Home Office the power not just to designate or individuals or organizations as terrorists, but also to designate areas, and to essentially make it illegal for British citizens or residents to travel to those areas. Now, there was no humanitarian exemption included in that bill originally, and it would have had a massive impact on staff of organizations who were British or who lived in Britain and who needed to travel to conflict-affected environments for the purposes of their work. And after a very focused lobbying campaign, an exemption for humanitarian organizations was introduced to that bill. We need to see a lot more advocacy around this issue in future in order to ensure that humanitarian organizations are protected from the worst impacts of counterterrorism measures on our work. Finally, I want to talk about some of the kind of recommended way forward that we have for dealing with this issue. I think a key one is the need for open dialogue between donors and the humanitarian community, and indeed with other stakeholders on this issue. Traditionally, NGOs have not been very open to widely discussing this issue, either within NGO coordination mechanisms or with donors. And this is, it's for a variety of reasons. It's partly because counterterrorism measures and discussions around them are often tied up with issues related to dealings with non-state armed groups, to operations in complex environments, and organizations can understandably be reticent to talk about some of these more sensitive topics. I will say that we are certainly seeing an increasing willingness among organizations to discuss these issues as in response to an ever more restrictive environment. But it's also crucial that we kind of widen the discussion and that we bring in other key actors here, those who may not be traditional interlocutors for us as humanitarian organizations. And here I'm talking about parliamentarians, people working in Treasury who are responsible for counter-terrorist financing rules, people working on the security side, on the counter-terrorism, the hard counter-terrorism side. These are where these measures are often being developed, and it's very important that we start to engage with a wider group of stakeholders so that they can take our concerns and the potential impacts on our operations into account in developing these measures. The issue of risk sharing, I quickly just want to mention, so I mentioned earlier this idea of risk transfer from donors onto humanitarian organizations, and what we're increasingly seeing from some donors is this zero tolerance approach towards counterterrorism measures in conflict environments, and that presents a very challenging environment for us, because zero tolerance stances, they're simply not compatible with working in what are very, very complex, very volatile environments. We have to be able to discuss issues and challenges as they arise, and if a donor espouses a really hardline zero tolerance approach, then that can really have the effect of shutting down the conversation before it even begins. So what we're encouraging donors to do is to be more open to discussing the risks and to sharing the risks with us. So it's not simply a sort of vendor relationship where they're passing the grants on to us and in the same in the same line also passing all of the risk on to us, that we have more of a shared responsibility towards this issue. Finally, I just mentioned the issue of clear guidance. often when we talk about these issues around counterterrorism, what we discover is that staff at field level feel they don't have clear guidance or clear indications from their head offices of what they're expected to do, what their responsibilities are, what they're allowed to do in relation to counterterrorism issues. Similarly, when we discuss with donors, they can often lack clarity too. And again, this comes back to the issue of the need for open dialogue. We need to kind of get clear on what responsibilities and expectations are, both within organizations and also from donors as well, in order to ensure that we can enable our colleagues who are working at field level to carry out their work in the safest possible way, and in a way that sort of enables them to do their work in a full way and doesn't constrain them. And I finally just finished by saying that when we discuss this issue, it's important for us to remember that we're not contesting states' rights to introduce counterterrorism measures. That's well within their rights. What we're doing is rather asking for balance in the development and application of these measures in order to ensure adequate protections for humanitarian action. I will leave it there.
Thank you, Emma. I mean, it's right. You're right that this is a whole conversation in itself, but we have a question for you specifically on joint advocacy, and I'd like to bring up the question from Kimia from the Democratic Republic of Congo. The question is, how can we engage, specifically more the UN humanitarian leadership, on the advocacy on some of these issues, especially counterterrorism? I mean, do you have any examples that you'd like to share of recent joint advocacy?
Good question. So as I kind of alluded to, this has traditionally been a challenging area for joint advocacy, but we have seen some strong advancements over the last year, or even 6 months or so. I mentioned in my presentation advocacy around the UK counterterrorism bill, which was a real advocacy win for humanitarian organisations, and specifically in relation to the UN. It's certainly true that we need to see a stronger stance taken by the UN agencies on this issue, and we need to see them speaking out more. Yesterday, a group of 13 NGOs sent a letter to USG Locock in advance of ECOSOC week, which is next week, urging OCHA to take action on this issue of counterterrorism, thanking them for the efforts that they've taken to date in this regard, but really asking them to step up their activities in relation to this issue and to take a leadership role within the UN in terms of trying to protect humanitarian action. And that's really something that we need to see them pointing the way on.
Great. Thanks so much, Emma. I know we have more questions for you, but we're going to move on now, and hopefully we'll be able to come back to it in the Q&A. I would like to welcome now to the virtual floor Pius Ajara, who has been the director of the South Sudan NGO Forum since December 2016, where he has been directly working on issues regarding civil society space in the country. He was previously a conflict advisor with DFID and a professor at Rupe Jesuit University in Harare, Zimbabwe, as well as head of Department for Research and Advocacy with the Refugee Law Project at Makerere University in Uganda. Now, Pius, I hope that the connection will work. We'll give it a try now. Let's see, do we have you on the line? Okay, very good. And I think, yeah, if you can speak closely to the mic, then I think this will work very well. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I decided really to frame the title in terms of our humanitarian diplomacy to protect operational space, because in South Sudan we're really in an interesting phase. Should we talk of civil humanitarian space or civil space? I call it operational space. Now, the context of South Sudan is really one of protracted emergency, which started in December 2013 due to political failure, which led to civil war. And the situation in South Sudan is pretty a difficult one. 80% of the population lives below poverty line, and nearly 4.5 million people have fled their homes, of which 2 million are internally displaced and about 2.5 are refugees. And about 60% of the population, that is nearly 7 million people, are facing food insecurity, crisis level, the worst. And then 1 in 5 deaths involve only one, involve skilled healthcare. And 70% of children who should be going to schools are not doing that. And nearly 1 million kids are facing the risk of severe malnutrition. That's the context in South Sudan. Now, in terms of the NGO forum and the civil society space, in South Sudan there is no law that allows civil society access to register, except for NGOs. The law is only for NGOs, so there is no real space for civil access in South Sudan. So the predominant actors in the civil society space are essentially NGOs, and in civil society landscape in South Sudan is therefore really an issue of NGOs. And in this case, one, there is no dedicated funding for what I call value-based programming, governance, accountability, human rights, advocacy, access to debt. There's no dedicated funding from donors for that. The fundings that are coming are purely and mostly on humanitarian response. And the forum has 331 members, employing about 24,000 staff, of which about 2,000 are international. And so you see that the forum members actually are providing employment opportunities, providing services, and building capacity of future leaders of the country, in addition also to paying the personal income tax. So that's where the forum sits in that space. Now, in terms of the space, there's a lot of pressure and demand on NGOs and NGO forum in that respect. Part of it is external set of pressure. Another set of pressure is internal. At the external pressure, you see there are always pressures around capping funds, donor fatigue, and all of that. That is creating pressure on NGOs. There is also legal ambiguities in South Sudan. How do you interpret these laws? Different lawyers and sometimes even different government institutions are interpreting the same provision differently and issuing circulars contradicting each other. That creates pressure on NGOs. And then also the politicization of humanitarian assistance. Statements are made, no strong evidence about it, what the humanitarian and what NGOs are doing. And then there is increasing restriction of what you can actually do, given that the law only applies to NGOs. It does not apply to civil society actors. As I said, people engage in value-based activities like human rights, access to justice. So that is creating quite a lot of pressure in that space. Now, in terms of the bureaucratic and access impediments, and here I'm really putting what we have encountered over the last few years when I joined the forum, is that we have quite a number there, and you might be quite familiar with restriction of movement. That can have very huge impact on threat, intimidation, harassment, and by the way, I say that over 100 NGOs staff have been killed in the front line. There's a lot of operational interference at sea level, custom restrictions, taxation, emerging, especially at local level, overnight. Interference with the staffing, decisions and processes, confiscation of assets, visa renewal, tax exemption denial, and registration renewal denial as well. So those are some of the key impediments that NGOs face in their operation there. Now, from there, what we have also seen is what are the factors or the agents that are impacting this case. As you can see from the list there, starting from legal ambiguity, which is leading to different interpretation and non-unified position of government institutions. You see also government entities there, the South Sudan People's Defense Forces, the county authorities, local authorities on the government side, Relief and Rehabilitation Commission is the body that registers NGOs in South Sudan. National Security Services is a security institution in South Sudan, very strong. Local authorities also of the armed opposition under the chairman, Riek Machar. The IDPs and IDP leaders themselves also are affecting operations, state government, communities around IDPs and their leaders, non-state armed actors. Actually, even as I talk now, just a few hours ago, some NGOs were ambushed when they're traveling somewhere in the middle of South Sudan and robbed of everything. So non-state actors are still very, very active in South Sudan, given the need also to consolidate the presence still there as a pressing need. And then the humanitarian wing of the armed opposition, because it's called the Relief Organization of South Sudan, that also puts its own restrictions. Interestingly, it's also UNMISS, the UN mission in South Sudan. This is connected with the bureaucratic processes we have to go through before things are cleared. So those are the actors and the agents that have impacted on the operation there. So what have we done? In South Sudan, we provide updates to members every day. Security updates, operational updates, contact updates on different issues. Like today, we had a discussion around development, how we can develop a guideline on customs clearance for humanitarian NGOs. This was literally today with the National Revenue Authority. We shared the update. We have maintained a very strong professional character. We are able to communicate with both government and opposition groups across the country, and we are able to communicate across a number of institutions as well. But we are only able to do that. We have maintained a very strong professional character, and we are famous for what we are. And then the other thing we do is we have developed strong relationships. I just said I'm able to communicate with national security services, senior government leaders, ministers, and the opposition group leaders. And I even wrote to, at one point last year, wrote to the leader of the armed opposition group, and the UK Special Envoy had to deliver our letter. And then we initiated a discussion at the humanitarian country team, where we were led by the humanitarian coordinator to meet with Dr. Riek Machar about the fees and taxes imposed in the armed opposition areas. And the result was they lifted the suspended the circular. We are engaging, therefore, in a number of critical issues, and we manage communication flow. It's so important to manage flow of communication when you're engaging with senior leadership, both government and armed opposition. We also issue public statements. We produce press statements. We go on media, on radio. We are on social media. So we are engaging also on the public radio in the country, sometimes in the newspaper itself. And then we document all the issues we are having and present them to the authorities bilaterally or in public meetings. I've met very many senior officials in South Sudan, including from the presidency to senior cabinet ministers to senior security and military authorities, to present these issues, and often they respond to that very constructively, and issues really have improved as a result in terms of space cooperation and keeping lines of communication open with everyone and being very transparent about it. We are also facilitating engagement between national and sub-national authorities. South Sudan is is a semi-federal government. So at the state level, authorities can make their own decision, come up with their own criteria, and we try to then check the relevant authorities, whether it be the Security, Ministry of Labor, Relief and Rehabilitation Commission, or any other institution relevant. We go with them and meet the state authorities, including the state governors and the cabinet. And we just had that last week in one of the states. And that really is helping to resolve a lot of issues. And also create relationship between the forum and NGOs, the forum and the state authorities. We have also facilitated evacuation in emergencies. There have been quite a number of critical situations where risks were very high to the safety and security of aid workers and NGOs. So we facilitate that with the in-house flights and coordinating with UN mission as well, where sometimes we ask members to move to the UN mission base. We also provide internship programs to young graduates because that has really helped build a relationship with communities across the country. We do provide a lot of briefing, workshops, training, and meetings to address issues. I attend all the meetings, heads of corporation meetings. My team provide a lot of briefing as well to UN, to government, and we have a nice different kinds of workshops. And that is really helping a lot. And then we work with the government, for example, to develop the NGO recruitment guidelines as a government policy. We contributed to drafting that, and the government adopted that, developing that together with us, and now that has a government policy. And we maintain very strong formal communication with donors, UN, and authorities. I already mentioned that. And critical is also forging a relationship of trust and confidence with everyone. That seems to make a big difference, that we have practiced. And then lastly, we organize social events at which we invite government donors, UN agencies, INGOs, and national NGOs, so that people can informally interact and build a sense of being part of a team that is working together to respond to the humanitarian situation in South Sudan. And also, this is also where we try to engage informally with the donors around how can we have dedicated funding for special national NGOs to do what we need to do, like civic education, governance, accountability, the kind of environment that is required and effective to the state in South Sudan. So that is really what we do in South Sudan, and as a result, we are actually able to tackle and address a number of the impediments that are coming up our way, and we are already preliminarily engaging with the government to work together in amending the NGO Act, which is supposed to come into place once the revitalized transitional government of national unity is formed sometime, hopefully in November.
Thank you very much, Pius, for sharing not only an elaboration of the challenges faced in the context in South Sudan, but also the very interesting practical examples of what's being done. Very interesting and useful to hear. A number of our participants have posed questions for you. However, we are running very short on time, and the connection is a bit challenging. I think, as with the other panelists today, we will ask that you potentially provide some responses in writing even after we finish the discussion, because people do, I think, want to hear a lot more from your experience. But now we're going to move to Thomas Nikolai Hanson. Thomas is team leader for civil society, as mentioned, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark, where he advises on civil society development, democratic governance, and human rights. He is trained as a political scientist and has lived and worked extensively in Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. Prior to his current position, he worked as an advisor in the civil society unit of the European Commission's Directorate General for International Cooperation and Development. And as mentioned, Thomas is joined also by his colleague Thomas Thompson, and the two of them will be sharing the microphone on their end. So over to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks from the Danish MFA for inviting us to be part of this webinar. Thomas and I have been learning a lot already, listening to previous speakers. Just to stress that I am representing the MFA from the civil society side of things, and I'm here together with Thomas Thompson, who is the team leader for our humanitarian engagement. And Thomas is not only close to me physically in the room here. Actually, we are trying from the Danish side to see how we can work better together, better use both the long-term civil society development funds and the humanitarian assistance. That's the core part of our current strategy. I should maybe also just emphasize that we are actually between governments right now in Denmark. So I need to make that observation. So as we are waiting for a new government to form, I can talk about what we have done and what our current strategy says, but of course I can't say anything about future priorities. We are waiting for a new government to be formed. Maybe just to say that when we in the Danish government stress the issue of civic space, it's a reflection of our priority for civil society in the global south. So basically, the underlying thread is here that we see civil society as a value in itself, and we stress the importance of an independent, civic, professional, holding authorities to account. And for that reason, we have taken a quite clear stance on the importance of civic space, and both developed a response, you can say, that both involves the programming sites which we represent, but it's an effort that we do quite closely with our human rights colleagues in the ministry and our representation in Geneva, for example. So you can say we have sort of a four-pronged approach, which I will try to briefly outline on the slide here. So the first part of our engagement is what we call international norms and standards. And you can see we have learned from David Moore and his previous presentation. We have had a very useful relation with ICNL, I should stress, to see how we as donors better can engage. So credit to ICNL for having influenced, I could say, how we address these issues. We are currently a member of the UN Human Rights Council, and there our colleagues in Geneva and our human rights colleagues in Copenhagen will of course have a clear focus on how civic space is being addressed in the work there. And notably the UPR, Universal Periodic Review Mechanism, is one tool where our colleagues in Geneva is seeing, are there specific recommendations to governments that are related to this area that can be used. And we try to make the link here between the countries where we have a programmatic engagement in the Global South. That's a challenge for any government. We're a little bit helped by the fact that we are a one-pillar system with both the programming and the policy under the guidance of our ministry. Then I would just like to flag briefly the importance of the SDGs. And we're trying to see how we can better showcase the importance of an independent, strong civil society for achievement of the SDGs. We are right now engaging with, along with many others, in how we can use the forthcoming high-level political forum in New York to shed a light on that. So there's an increased awareness of why civil society, and notably civic space enabling environment, is crucial. Then I should certainly stress the role of the EU. That's not only at country level in the dialogue, but certainly also the policies and instruments that are developed in Brussels. I can point to instruments like UN human rights country strategies, civil society roadmaps, etc. These kind of tools we try to engage through our representation in Brussels to make sure these are aligned and support civic space. And lastly but not least, we have on the donor side quite a close coordination on these issues, and there have been numerous events in the past year where we come together to see how we can better craft and learn from each other and work better together on these issues. So that's sort of speaking for international norms and standards. Then that's not all done. We try to globally support civil society, both on the advocacy side but also on the awareness side. And here we have a number of engagement and grants, and again I mentioned ICNL before, which is one of our partners. So is Civicus, and on the more humanitarian side, we have an engagement with the Center on Competence on Humanitarian Negotiation. So in that sense, we're trying to sort of fuel awareness, knowledge on the importance of civic space. I believe it was Emma OLeary who said that we need to do a lot more in advocacy on this topic, and that's what we're trying to do with these different relations. And of course, ICVA is also part of the package here from a Danish perspective. Then if we go to the country level, these are things that are in process. I'm not saying this is all done spick span, but we're trying to have a systematic approach to how we address civic space in the instruments we have at our country policies, country programs. And for us, of course, the EU and the larger like-minded group of donors is the for where we can have a dialogue with authorities. Denmark, with all justice, is a small country, and of course we should not be naive in terms of what we can do single-handedly. We shouldn't. So we attach a lot of importance to the EU dialogue here. And then, as the ICVA paper said, governments are not monolithic. In some cases it's a lack of faith, in others it's a lack of capacity, and a combination. Each context is of course specific. But there are often change agents inside authorities at local level, regional, whatever. And there we try to find agents through which we can work and support this agenda. Finally, and most importantly, the dialogue and support to local civil society. I think there is, from our side, no question that the most important thing is to contribute to a strong local civil society. We do that through partnerships with our Danish CSO partners. So the equivalent of Norwegian Refugee Council, we have a number of partners similar in Denmark. And there we have really put a strong light on civic space as an area where we need to build capacity and contribute to that. Then there's the emergency side of things. One thing is the long-term capacity development. The other thing is the need for rapid response, where, for example, we have engaged with an organization like Frontline Defenders. I'd also just like to refer, Emma mentioned that the relation between a donor and an organization is not a donor-vendor relation, and we really tried to see if we can develop what we call strategic clusters. So, for example, we have a regular discussion with a number of our CSO partners on, for example, the grand bargain commitments and how we can lift those. So that's more sort of a shared responsibility, I believe was the word used by Emma. And then Pius' excellent presentation just before underlines the importance of my second bullet here, direct support to and dialogue with local CSO platforms. I was quite impressed to hear the range of activities that are being launched in the case of South Sudan. And that's exactly the coalition building at country and regionally is an important factor. So let me just stop with a few dilemmas, and then I would just, once I've done with this slide, I would just ask if my colleague Thomas could contribute with a few ending remarks from our side. But maybe just to say that the dialogue on human rights and civic space is a difficult dialogue, of course, and sometimes it has to be an open dialogue, sometimes it has to be a very more sort of subtle diplomacy, and that requires, of course, a lot of diplomatic skill. We also see sometimes that maybe it's not always the best case to be very open in terms of how the Danish government supports a certain NGO or not, or civil society organization. I'm also here making reference to the sort of foreign agents regulations and laws we see in certain countries where there's a certain suspicion of being associated with foreign donors. And then, of course, we try to be more and more proactive, but we also find ourselves jumping from one fire to the next, reacting to legislative changes or harassments, etc., in different countries. So there's a lot to keep up with there. And I believed also it was Pius referring to the fact that, well, if you are a formal NGO, registration, no problem. But a lot of the movers and shakers that we should really engage with are difficult to engage with due to their more informal nature. And then just the hot topic right now for us, I was just in Tunis all over last week at a conference on human rights and technology. On one side, the increasing tendency of authorities to close digital space, but also the endless opportunities that civil society can take here. So please let me finish here, and then if I could ask the organizers to give the microphone to the other Thomas. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas. I'll just take you through a couple of the more practical elements that we work on in support of our humanitarian partners, working basically in a number of protracted situations where access, where civic space is an issue. Looking at the ICVA report, you could actually categorize that into, for instance, challenges related to access. We play a relatively limited role in terms of that, except by advocating to the UN, in particular OCHA and UNHCR, on the need for improved access. It depends on the setting, of course. It's obvious that OCHA in particular plays a key role in terms of this, but a lot also depends in many settings on the skills of NGOs themselves. We are interested in that in many ways. We look, for instance, in Afghanistan, where NGO staff for years have been negotiating security at the local level, supported by us in the sense that we provided funding for that, we provide funding for security systems, etc., and for direct linking with local communities. We are also interested in building general capacity for this, and we are, for the same reason, supporting frontline negotiations, which was established by ICRC, WFP, UNHCR, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, MSF, etc., in the form of the Center of Competence on Humanitarian Negotiation. With regard to challenges related to bureaucracy and administrative barriers, as well as legal barriers at the national level, we are potentially more active, depending again on the context. We may, for instance, in some cases, intervene on behalf of our partners with local authorities, with national authorities. We may do it informally, or we may do it formally. Sometimes we take the initiative to generate joint donor action, for instance through the European Union or with other groups of like-minded countries. That could be at the international level, for instance, working through the EU COHAFA, as it is called, or it could be at donor conferences, or it could be through donor coordination at the national level. Much depends on the setting, and we need at all times to take the risk of backlash into account for all involved, including NGOs themselves. One of the preconditions here, if we are to support NGOs, is clearly that NGO partners have adhered to local laws and regulations, for instance, in terms of being registered. Non-compliance will make it next to impossible for us to do anything. With regard to counterterrorism, Emma had an excellent presentation on that. It is a very, very tricky issue. We continuously advocate for necessary exemptions for humanitarian actors to be in place, for instance, in Somalia. Finally, challenges related to intimidation and harassment. Well, again, it depends very much on circumstances as to whether we can do something meaningful, and if so, how. We do have examples of quiet diplomacy, either directly or through the UN. And that, I think, generally depends, in terms of humanitarian NGO access, on their knowledge of the political economy, the legal frameworks, etc., in places where they set up shop. It is simply necessary to building better relations and acceptance as a basis for humanitarian access that NGOs really ensure that they have the full overview of the political economy, of legal frameworks in place, etc. Otherwise, you may end up in creating greater harm than good, creating animosity and so forth, apart from transferring risk to local partners. This is especially the case when NGOs involve in remote management, whereby risks indeed are transferred to local partners, and that actually also leads potentially to less knowledge about issues of humanitarian access in the delivery of humanitarian assistance. And it certainly also leads to less knowledge about the overall contextual situation. But I think I'll leave it at that and hand over to the organizers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to both our speakers. And it's a very interesting. We're having a quick question to you because we are already almost out of time. But we have a Fakir from United Kingdom who's asked us. Donors and member states mainly provide funds to UN agencies or ICRC for obvious reasons. And this is what you mentioned as well, you know, looking at the risk management aspect, the counterterrorism action that was mentioned by Emma, etc. But what is it that needs to be done to change this approach so that NGOs, especially local national NGOs, are able to feel empowered and are also looking at the trust building aspect? How can we do better, or what can be done differently? Over. Thank you.
I think actually it's not correct to say that we as a donor, I really can't speak on behalf of other donors, but I do think we, and a number of other donors of course as well, do actually prioritize funding for NGOs. A very significant part of our overall humanitarian budget is channeled through Danish NGO partners and through them to a range of local partners in a number of crisis situations worldwide. Secondly, we prioritize very much the country-based pooled funds, and in doing so, one of the reasons for that is really that the country-based pooled funds have proven increasingly to be excellent channels for funding local NGO partners in a way that we cannot do ourselves. One of the issues for us is indeed capacity. We are sitting here in Copenhagen. We have limited capacity in embassies that can actually ensure the necessary dialogue, accountability, etc., with local partners. Therefore, we have to work through larger international setups. But for us, localization is indeed a priority, and we think that the country-based pooled funds, along with NGO networks that we're working through, are actually excellent conduits for that. So I think the actual situation is somewhat more diverse.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And just to note that we have gone slightly over time, we are going to wrap everything up now, and I would like to go around the table, virtual table, for very, very brief 30-second closing remarks to get some final thoughts from each of our speakers. We'll go first to David, then to Emma, then Pius, and then back to you, Thomas and Thomas. So very briefly, over to you, David. Having heard your colleagues on the panel and seen the action in the chat, anything you'd like to leave us with today?
Yes, thank you, Hara. Just to say that it's encouraging, I think, to hear about some of the focused efforts that Emma was addressing in terms of counterterrorism and some of the country-level efforts that Pius described in South Sudan. ICNL is available as a resource to organizations at the national and international level that are seeking to deal with effective responses. And I'd encourage those who are participating in the call, to feel free to reach out to ICNL. And I also look forward to hopefully receiving some questions from the organizers so I can get back to participants in writing.
That'll be very much appreciated. Thanks so much, David, and thanks for joining us. Now over to you, Emma. What would you like to leave with us?
Thank you. I would just briefly say that for those on the call, I would really strongly encourage you, like if the issue of counterterrorism and its impact resonates with you at all, to encourage you to engage with your colleagues in the field. If you're in the field, start looking, if you haven't already, about how you think this issue might be affecting your operations. Is it slowing bank transfers? Is it potentially contributing to risk aversion in terms of operations in areas under the control of non-state armed groups? Find out how this issue is affecting your operations, and just continue to raise it. Raise it at HCT level, raise it with donors, raise it with relevant governments, because really by continuing to raise these examples of the impacts that these measures are having on our operations, that's how we can best affect change.
Thank you, Emma. Thanks again for joining, and I hope that we'll have another opportunity to carry on the discussion. There's clearly much more to talk about here. Now, to Pius, once again, crossing fingers that we can reach you. Are you on the line?
I found this very enlightening, and what I can say really is that protecting and expanding civic and humanitarian space is really work in progress. It is work in progress in building relationships of trust and confidence.
Thank you so much, Pius, and thanks for your patience with the technology today. Now, last but not least, back to you, Thomas. Any final words?
Yeah, thanks again from our side. I have to say, first of all, we were quite encouraged by the, again, as I said, intervention from Pius, because it really confirms that the strong civil society and global south, a strong organization, is really what matters in the long term. I was also confirmed about the importance of keep stressing the global advocacy, which Emma stressed, and then maybe having this conversation where we are bringing sort of the development governance type together with the humanitarian community confirms really that there's a lot of value added, because in a way we are pursuing similar agendas, and I think there could be a lot of impact gained from continuing this closer conversation between these two camps that should be working together more. Thank you.
Thank you, and absolutely agree on that point. It would be great to continue the discussion on this vein. So now we're going to wrap things up. As mentioned, the recordings and all of the resources that have come up today will be available in the next few days on the event webpage. They'll also go out by email. As well, once the event has been translated, ICVA will be providing subtitles for the recording in French and Arabic. Now, I think Nishani wanted to come in, for some additional points regarding engagement on the issue. Over to you, Nishani.
Thanks, Angharad. And ICVA will continue to engage in various platforms for humanitarian action on the shrinking space for NGOs and civil society. And this is an ongoing discussion and engagement, especially under the IAC Results Group 1 Operation Response and Results Group 3 Collective Advocacy. ICVA, together with Interaction, is co-chairing the task force to address bureaucratic impediments imposed on NGOs. And under humanitarian financing, ICVA is looking at supporting NGOs' access to principled quality funding, and we will continue to engage with member states, multilateral organizations to ensure respect and adequate space for civil society to engage in policy discussions. And we will also continue to work and bring together discussions and spaces such as this today with PHAP, what we had with a webinar, and to bring in organizations like Civicus, ICNL, and look at other tools available to engage better on this subject. Just to mention, there are two UN mechanisms, the ECOSOC and the Human Rights Council sessions that are starting next week here in Geneva, that we also discussing some of these issues we had already. The reports were shared with you online. There will also be the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and Association on the 10th anniversary of the mandate, who will submit a report next year in June to the Human Rights Council that will take stock of the last 10 years of freedom of peaceful assembly and association relevant to civil society. And do not hesitate to contact ICVA for any further information. And thank you, everybody, for being part of this interesting and exciting discussion.
Excellent, and thank you, Nishani. Now, to look to upcoming events in this learning stream on navigating change, in 2019 we have coming up a session on the Global Compact on Refugees, the GCR, what does it mean for NGOs? And separately, a session on sharing and mitigating risk in a changing humanitarian environment. The dates for those will be announced soon, and we hope that you will all consider joining us once again online. So with that, I would like to thank all of our participants, our panelists, my co-facilitator, Nishani, for their proactive involvement today, fascinating, important questions, and to the speakers in particular for their valuable input. We look forward to following up with all of you on this. With that, yes, we'll sign off, and please fill the survey so that we can take your inputs and lessons learned from this discussion and roll them forward into the next. And Nishani, a final word?
Well, thanks, and we continue the discussion.
Terrific. All right, that's Hara, the rest of the team of PHAP, and Nishani and colleagues signing off from Geneva.